Recovery Sort Of is a podcast where we discuss recovery topics from the perspective of people living in long-term recovery. This podcast does not intend to represent the views of any particular group, organization, or fellowship. The attitudes expressed are solely the opinion of its contributors. Be advised, there may be strong language or topics of an adult nature.
Welcome back. It's Recovery Sort Of. I am Jason, a guy who is not telling his story today.
And I'm Billy. I'm a person in long-term recovery.
And you've probably guessed, we came up with the idea. Billy did. I'll give him all the credit. He wanted for us to take turns telling our stories. Not necessarily so much in the way we'd share it in a meeting, although I feel like mine's going to be exactly the way we shared it in a meeting when it comes time, but just more of a exploration of our stories. And so that's what we're going to do. And of course, I'm making Billy go first because that sounds way better for me. Yeah. So take it away, Billy.
Yeah. So one of my motivations for doing this is I've come to understand in my life at this point that everyone comes from different places and we all grew up in different environments. We come into this thing of life with different tools and skills and abilities. And, that's what makes each of us unique and special and wonderful. And everybody has a story to tell, everybody has a fascinating things about them. And a lot of people never fucking get asked about themselves or get a chance to talk about themselves or their experience in their life. And so I wanted to share with our listeners, something about us, more than just what we share on here and where we come up with our fucking dime store psychology ideas. And
what are you going to do when everybody reaches out for sponsorship from you?
They probably won't. So anyway, and I just wanted to get a chance for our listeners to get to know us, who we are and where we come from. So I'll start with myself. I'm 47 now. Getting old. I was born and raised in Baltimore City. My parents were healthy, normal people, young 20s.
Debatable.
Yeah, they might have been unhealthy. They were as healthy as I recognize healthy people to be. And so I was born and raised in Baltimore City. My parents were I'm going to say working middle class family. We grew up in a row house in Hamden.
Didn't they own a business?
Well, at that time, my dad just worked for his family's business. He didn't own it at that time. Okay. So, and get a little bit into that. But so my family, I came from a retail background. My family owned a luggage and leather good business called Turk Speckers. It started in 1899, actually in downtown Baltimore. And then it spread throughout the years. It got as big as 40-something retail stores across, Virginia all the way up to I think as far north, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. They had stores in Detroit, but they were all in shopping malls and a lot of malls all around the country. And at that time, my dad was just employed by the business. His father was running it, which would have been the third generation. So when I was a young kid, my dad just worked there. I couldn't even tell you exactly what he did. I don't know what his job was. He just worked there in some capacity. And so we had, a working middle class upbringing. We certainly weren't poor by any stretch. We had things that we wanted. My parents put us all into private Catholic school. We were Catholic, although in our household we weren't overly Catholic. There wasn't prayer or any of that going on a regular basis. We were just, I think my dad put us in Catholic school and we went to church on Sundays because of my grandmother, his mother, more than anything, because that was his upbringing.
It's always fascinating to me because a buddy of mine from Baltimore also went to Catholic school, and yet there was very little religion in his house. And I was like, it's always weird to me.
Well, the other upside, I should say, to Catholic school for my parents anyway was that at the time the school we would have went to would have been 55, which in Baltimore, if you ever heard of that, came notoriously a bad school. I can't say that it still is, but back then
56?
in the 80s it was It might have been 56.
Well, 55 was elementary school. That's where I went. I was
so that would have been where I went to elementary school.
But 56 was the middle school, which was pretty rough.
Yeah. So anyway, it was an inner city school that didn't have great, reputations. And so they didn't want us to go to city public school system. And so they got us out of public school system and put us in. And I had an older sister. Because I do remember vaguely going to public school in like kindergarten and first grade. So I don't know if something happened or somewhere along the line. My sister would have been in probably third grade at that time. So whatever reason, they pulled us out, put us in Catholic school, and we started taking the public bus. So we would take the bus from Hamden all the way across to Mount Washington, and we would go through. We took the public bus with a lot of kids that went to Polytech. Which at the time was fascinating because we had our little school, uniforms on, and this were kids that were, Poly is a predominantly black school, and a lot of kids that were high into fashion. So they had the cool sneakers and the cool outfits and stuff, and we had to wear these nerdy, Catholic school outfits to school.
Was that LA Gears back then?
I don't know. Well, I do remember and being on the bus, and say we took the public bus, and they would have those big ginormous fucking boom boxes. I mean, big as a piece of luggage. Kids would carry those things.
I think you bring up two relevant points with this story. One, why is the only alternative to public school religious school? Right, Michael, why don't we have, if you don't want to send your kid to public school, why not have a private school that's not religious? Why do we have to choose religion when you don't want? And the other point of you said you don't know if something happened because you were in public school and then you weren't, and you had an older sister, and the secrecy of families, and not that kids necessarily need to know everything. But yeah, we do as families in America tend to really keep secrets, not only from outside the family, right? But even inside the family, there's a ton of fucking secrets, which I think is not healthy for us.
That's a big part of my story growing up is those having issues of sort of, the elephant in the room issues and no one talking about it. My wife has pointed that out as I got older, growing up in an environment where that was completely normal not to talk about the most obvious, ginormous problems. And for my wife, when I met her, she had 12 years clean, and her coming in and seeing the dynamic in my family and being why is nobody talking about this? We don't talk about that shit. What are you talking, and to her pointing out how uncomfortable and unhealthy that stuff was. To me, that was eye-opening. I'm what do you mean? You don't talk about things like this.
Well, and I think as kids, we tend to think, oh, kids don't pick up on anything. They don't know as long as we don't bring it out in the open, But kids are way better, I think, than most adults at tuning in to the vibe, the tension, the mood, the atmosphere. And so, that's a very early point of, things not lining up. I got these parents that say everything is fine and everything on the surface looks fine, and yet I have this feeling inside that says something's off. And that's incongruity, which doesn't lead to you feeling like you have a good concept of understanding the world. You can't trust yourself now because you're oh, well, I don't feel right, but everybody says it is. So something's obviously wrong with just, the way I pick up on things.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, so as a kid going to private school, it was a small school. I played sports. I got good grades, was very involved, very active in school. I always learned and picked up things really well. They didn't really have gifted and talented. It wasn't like a Catholic school that took trouble kids. If you were trouble in that school, you got thrown out. They only kept kids that were good academically and good students and that, showed up regularly. And I'm sure could afford to pay.
Why didn't you go to St. Thomas? Right in the neighborhood. It was a Catholic school.
So that's where we actually went to church. We didn't go to school there.
Why?
I couldn't tell you. You'd have to ask my parents. I wasn't involved in the decision-making, process of that. But that's actually where we went to church, was St. Thomas, where my grandmother went. So, yeah, and the two, I would say, relevant things happened as I was a young kid, probably before the age of 10, or I say relevant. I'm sure there's lots of other relevant things, but two major life-changing things that happened one, I was sexually abused at that age, from the age of, and it's hard to remember exactly because it's such vague memories that I spent, 30 years of my life stuffing down and ignoring with drugs and that sort of thing. But probably from the age of like 7 to 9, somewhere in that range, several times being sexually abused by an older family member who was a older cousin. He was an older teenager at the time. And, we would go over their house to hang out like you would. My mom's family was close. They all lived over in Medfield, if you know, right next to Hamden, a couple blocks away. And my mom had another sister that lived in Hamden, a couple blocks from us. So her sisters all lived around. The family was kind of close, and they hung out with each other. So we'd go over there and hang out. Oh, and they had a swimming pool at their house, which was the reason we went over to their house a lot. And, so there was opportunities there. He took advantage and sexually abused me. My brother, I've come to learn some other family members besides us, come to find out later. And that was, at the time, I don't know how that affected me. I mean, as a kid, that shit's, you don't process it like you do when you're older, when you're going through it. And, but some weird things about that, not to make this too creepy, but like, so this guy had a lot of like Matchbox cars and like these cool Matchbox things and all this fun stuff. And he would, sort of lure you up to his room with these cool things. And I liked to play with those things. But then being in that situation was really uncomfortable and weird. But then when we went there, I would put myself back in that situation, being lured with those things. So there would be a sense of like, as I got older, trying to figure out how this happened, like, well, I must have liked it, or I put myself, that victim stuff that we tell ourselves that have come to find out isn't true, that is very unhealthy.
Well, and the part of it I think that's damaging is we take on this blame of, I chose it in the sense of I chose it all. And it's like if we had an older, cousin that was charged with taking care of us for times when our parents had to have emergencies or went on vacation together or something, and they fed us ice cream all day long, and then we take responsibility for how that affected our health later.
Right.
Like, well, of course we fucking chose ice cream. Like, it felt good, right? And I think we missed that. Just because you're a child does not mean your sexual organs, they might not work like an adult. Shit still feels good.
Yeah.
And that's nothing wrong with you because of that. That's how they're programmed to work.
Right. And not only at that age, no one's talking about sex or any of that stuff at all. So you have no point of reference. And definitely back in the 80s, it is a little more talked about now, probably not near as much as it even should be. But there was no conversations, and definitely none around Catholic school around sex or, what was healthy and what wasn't healthy, or any, parents weren't talking about it. None of that at that age. And they probably shouldn't have been. I mean, I wouldn't talk to my 5-year-old about sex, other than touching. Now there's touching conversations. But in any case, so that was a, major event that happened. And then also I had an eye accident. I was I should know this, but I was between 10 and 12 years old. I was in a farm store and carrying some soda bottles, and I dropped a soda bottle, and somehow glass shot up and cut into my eyeball.
Just to clarify for everyone, because I call them the farm store as well, but I found out from my wife that everybody in other areas thinks of a farm store as places that sell tractors and shit. Oh. This is a Royal Farms, which is like a 7-Eleven or a gas station, a Wawa. It's a little convenience store.
When you grew up in the 80s in the city, it was called the farm store. That's what but it was now it's Rofo.
Right.
Rebranding. So anyway, that caused me to have an eye injury. Through that, I went through a couple of surgeries, ended up having to wear glasses. I hated that. I felt, as a kid, for a number of reasons, whether that's a contributing one or whether I already felt that way. But as I got into early teens, I felt different. I felt, unique. I felt like people weren't going to like me, that nobody understood me. There was things about being sexually abused. I thought, does this make me gay? Am I gay in some way?
Not because your eye.
Yeah, not because my eye.
Okay, clarify.
And then, of course, wearing glasses, and that was another thing. I was good at school, and I got really good grades, and I also played sports, which seemed to be a little bit of a contradiction. That didn't seem to be a thing that most people did. or that I saw anyway.
Right.
I can't say it's not a thing that most people did. And so as I started getting into being a early teen, it was like, well, do I want to be cool and hang out with the cool kids, or do I want to hang out with like the nerd kids that are getting good grades in school? And, you know, to me, that's where that appeal to sort of the bad crowd came in, is like I almost wanted to be a bad kid to fit in with that crowd more. Because my gut was to like do good in school and follow the rules and get approval. Like that felt like the right thing to do. But I was so worried I would be rejected and my peers wouldn't like me, or the people that I chose to be peers with. I mean, there were both peer groups. I just chose to be with the kids that were getting in trouble and doing things. And even at in the city before we moved, I started delving into some sexual stuff at a really young age. At 10, 11, 12, I was like, you know, looking at dirty magazines and stuff with kids in the neighborhood. That stuff would come up. And that's probably too young to be exposed to most of that without any sort of anyone talking to you from an adult or healthy perspective. It was like just being sexually abused and misinformation from kids in the neighborhood. So there was a lot of, and then Catholic school where they don't talk about any of that stuff at all, other than you're not supposed to do it or you're going to hell.
Right. Do it when you want kids.
Yeah. So growing up that way, like I started to feel like I was destined for hell, that something was definitely internally wrong with me. And then we moved from the city to Cecil County out to Rising Sun, which was like the fucking complete and utter opposite of anything that we had experienced. We moved into a giant farmhouse. It was like a 7-bedroom house built in the 1890s, you know, had a bunch of rooms, big tall ceilings.
Why did you move?
So at that point, my grandfather had retired. My dad took over the business, so he was probably, I'm guessing, again, I don't know for sure, but I guess he was making a lot more money. My mom wanted to get out of the city. She didn't want to live in the city anymore and wanted to move to the county. So we moved to, I don't know how they found the house in Cecil County. Again, I wasn't involved in any of that decision making. Nobody asked my opinion as a kid.
How do you find a house in Cecil County?
So they ended up finding this house out in Rising Sun, and I mean, from the outside, it probably looked great. Like we're moving to this little small town. I mean, at the time, Rising Sun was just several hundred people. There was very small. You know, our elementary school was really small, and so we moved out there to Rising Sun, and it was definitely a different, like a culture shock, a culture thing. Kids were doing different stuff. You know, kids around me had dirt bikes and were riding motorcycles and four-wheelers and hunting and shooting guns, and you know, like I wasn't around any of that kind of stuff growing up, like just none of it. So that contributed to the uncomfortableness, the not feeling like I fit in, and then just doing whatever I could to fit in and be a part of. So early on in my, say, I was 12 when we moved. From 13 to probably 16, 17, I basically would say I was a redneck, like I immediately jumped in with both feet and like, I'm gonna, have a mullet and, get into that kind of stuff. And
people had mullets back then?
Yeah. It was the 80s, man.
I didn't think it was real.
Yeah. Oh, see my high school graduation picture. I have a mullet.
Put that in this video somewhere.
Yeah, so then we moved to Rising Sun, and just things were different. It was a different way of life. It was a lot of things. To me, was very appealing. I liked it. I liked being out around nature, around the country, getting into that kind of stuff. Our neighbor, his family was from West Virginia. They were total hillbillies, and I was all in with that. I went to West Virginia with his relatives, for family trip a couple times because we were good friends. But that was around the age of 13 or so. I was entered to smoke pot for the first time. And immediately when I smoked pot for that first time, I loved it. I thought right away, like, this is the thing that I've been looking for my whole life. All of a sudden, all that uncomfortableness and the way I felt about myself, like I didn't care. I was relaxed. I was calm. I actually smoked some weed. I went to a party with some other kids, and I felt so different. And just knew that that's what I just wanted to do all the time. And that kind of started, my endeavor into drugs.
I wonder if that's like that discussion in the courage episode we had, just that, feeling that 25 level and smoking the weed. And now I feel that normal 75 that everybody else seems to have all the time or other times.
Yeah, well, it was definitely, I'll make you, I guess in this term, maybe it's okay, but it was definitely a crutch to like get over any sort of social anxiety or any anxiety that I felt. I could get high and that went away.
It's funny that we look at the term crutch as a negative, right? You wouldn't ever think somebody who had just broken their foot, you wouldn't be like, oh, disgusting, you need a crutch.
Right.
But if somebody is broken internally, why wouldn't they need something to assist them to, be able to function as someone who's not broken?
Right.
That just seems like, yeah, duh.
And there were some other things too so as a young kid, like I was really late to hit puberty. So I was early exposed into sexual stuff, but I didn't hit puberty till I was like 17. I mean, I was
the weed.
Probably, it was probably the weed that fucked me all up. But like at 13 years old, I was one of like the shortest, smallest kids in elementary school, even into early high school. I mean, I don't think I really got much taller until I hit like 16, 17.
Your mom was a smoker. Did she smoke during pregnancy?
Probably.
Ooh.
I mean, I would guess.
That's kind of before we even
knew much about that. But I would guess so.
It wasn't as widely like, that's not good.
Yeah.
What if that had anything to do with it?
And again, all these are little things. Like, I don't know what one thing made me feel so inadequate as I got older, but it's all these little things that just lead up to a bigger problem. But there was always a feeling of like not measuring up, not having to be somebody different than who I was. And then about, and through that, smoking weed, that starts to introduce you to different crowds of people.
Yeah.
This mostly started with my sister had an older boyfriend. She was a little older than me. She's 2 years older than me. So she was 15 and her boyfriend was like 2 years older than her. So he was like 17. And then one of his good friends, who's a guy I'm still friends with today, actually, thought it was fun to get all the kids to smoke weed. Like he thought that shit was fun. And, they were into like sort of the heavy metal rock music and had like the long hair and, this was like the Rambo / Red Dawn time in the late 80s where it was like, yeah, if the commies come, we're going to run out to the woods and build a fort and like hold them all off with, with guns. And yeah, so we would go out into the woods and build forts and, do all kinds of dumb shit while we were smoking weed and drinking and carrying on as kids.
I mean, looking at the situation today, y'all might have been able to hold off the Red Army. Just saying.
But, that was where my using started. And in the beginning, it didn't have a ton of negative consequences. I mean, I kept up with my grades. I still played sports. I started smoking cigarettes real young. I'm sure that didn't help with the growth stuff either, and, but that crowd of people, that the bad kids that were into, the bad stuff. Yeah, that was what appealed to me. That's what I thought was cool. And that's what I wanted to be. But it was hard to let go of like getting good grades and playing sports. But slowly but surely that stuff started to go away. And, I did graduate with honors from high school. I was plans to go to college and do all this kind of stuff. And, I could see at that point in my life, my addiction had really taken off. I graduated when I was 17. And I would say probably full-blown addiction at that point. I hadn't gotten into most of the heavy drugs, but I was drinking alcohol every day, smoking pot every day, would do like coke or any other acid, any other kind of drugs that came along the availability of those things at 16 and 17 wasn't the same as I got old. As I got older, I got more access to resources. But young, it was like anytime anything came along, I was never afraid to do it or try it or whatever. And along with that came other bad behavior, sneaking out of the house, ditching school, and the things that I thought were important weren't important, and what became important was just partying and having a good time. And so at 17, I graduated high school and thought, I'll go to college later. I'll do all this stuff later. There'll be time to and I always had minor jobs. Like I worked for my family's business at one point, and I thought, well, that's a cop out. That's an easy job to have, Plus I was using all the time, and I was worried like if I worked actually with my parents, people would know what I was doing. So I got other jobs at other places, and I always maintained held a part-time job so that I could have access to money. Because I liked having all my own money. I didn't like having to lie, cheat, or steal for drugs. So I had access to money. I had access to drugs, and I could...
That's a good story.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's true or not, but that's a good story.
So, a lot of my early use, I've never had to resort to actually, sticking up people on the street or doing any of that stuff. As I got into harder drugs later, there was definitely manipulation and that kind of thing. But I was never oh my God, I got to go out and steal shit to support my habit. Which I think is what contributed to me thinking, I don't really have a problem. These fucking guys have a problem. I'm doing fine. I got a job. I support myself. You know what I mean? I'm doing good.
Right.
But I got in some pretty serious trouble at 17. I actually was out the summer after I graduated. I was out partying with a friend of mine, and got pulled over. We were drinking and driving, and we had a 1/4 pound of pot in the car that was all divided up into separate baggies. And that sounds a lot bigger than what it was actually. The story sounds like we were dealing drugs, and we sort of kind of were, but it was homegrown backwoods, rising sun, crappy pot that his uncle grew.
Right.
It's one of those kind of deals. It wasn't some great weed that we were doing. Anyway, long story short, the cops don't care if it's backwoods rising sun weed or not. To them, it's a whole bunch of weed, and it's all divided into baggies. And so I ended up with some pretty serious criminal charges out of that.
Caught a big-time dealer out here.
Yeah.
On my resume.
And that started me into the legal system of oh, great, now I'm into court and probation and judges. And, at that time, my parents got me a lawyer, and I went to treatment. My first time into treatment, I was 17. It was a private adolescent rehab, and it was fun. It was like a summer camp. It was great. It was out in the woods, out down in Lower Delaware, and the program at the time was called New Beginnings at White Oak, which they're not around anymore. I don't know whatever happened to them.
It didn't work.
If that place is, yeah, right. But they had a ropes course, and you would go, and they did all these trust exercises with, and it was my first introduction to recovery and addiction, and that there was a problem, with my using. And I definitely wasn't ready to stop. I only went there for court stuff. But, what I remember was that's the first time that I had actually talked to another human being about being sexually molested. I actually talked to a counselor there when I had gotten clean for the 30 days or whatever that you were in there. I told him what happened. He asked if I wanted to talk to my parents about it. I said, I don't want to talk to them about it. You can talk to them about it if you want to, but I'm good. That was the extent of that.
You got 30 days off the bat.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
So, I got out of that place and immediately went right back to doing what I did and getting high because I didn't want to stop using.
Right. Was there a period where it seemed alleviated then, though? Was it oh, I don't have to use as much and I don't have to be as bad, so to speak? I don't know. I feel like you held a job the whole time, so that really didn't.
Yeah. And that's, of course, part of all the contradictions of myself. It's I was always in some state of trying to manage my using. I and manage is such a loose term in that respect. I didn't frequently, I should say, used to the point where it's like, oh my God, I can't go to work the next day. You know, that happened occasionally, but like that would happen. I'd be like, whoa, fuck, that's a problem. Like, I can't do that. So as long as I can still like make it to work the next day. And I would use these justifications, you know, to sort of manage my using. And I started looking at like the wrong markers for things. So like I would look at things like, well, I made it to work as the goal, not I'm actually showing up with an ability to actually do the job in any functional manner. You know?
I made it to work. I took a nap for 4 hours, but I made it.
Yeah, and I just had jobs that either didn't matter that much, or one of them was like a cleaning company where we went out and cleaned offices at night. And one of the guys that worked there, we got high when we went there. So, you know, whatever kind of shitty work we did, it didn't really matter that much. I mean, it was emptying trash cans and sweeping floors, you know, it wasn't like overly difficult. So yeah, then I started in.
There's just some joke in there about working for cleaning while you're living dirty or something, but I don't think that way anymore. So
yeah. This episode has been brought to you in part by Voices of Hope, Inc., a nonprofit recovery organization made up of people in recovery, family members, and allies. Together, members strive to protect the dignity of those that use drugs and those in recovery by advocating for treatment, harm reduction and support resources, and mentoring. Please visit us at www.voicesofhopemaryland.org and consider donating to our cause. In that rehab, though, I was first introduced to 12-step recovery, NA meetings, AA meetings, all that stuff. I did sort of immediately felt at home in NA meetings, mostly because, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, that seemed like all old dudes in fucking AA, and it was all people that I could relate to in NA. It was, even though I was young, it was guys I was familiar with from around like their Rising Sun party scene. It was old biker pagan guys, and you know what I mean, like people that use drugs. They have a kind of similar look to them. I don't know.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And so I felt, and there was younger people there too, and you know, I just felt more at home in NA meetings. But of course, I didn't stay clean, and this is where things get really hazy, because then my using really progressed into like my early 20s. I ended up in treatment again at some point in an adult treatment center. My using definitely got to the point where it was a lot of harder drugs more often, you know, lots of acid trips and cocaine. Heroin wasn't a big thing around back then, so it wasn't as available, but crank, I think that's crystal meth, I'm not sure. They used to call it crank. That's what the old bikers used to call it. You know, that's where you get the crank from, the old biker dudes. And you know, just doing whatever was available, whatever I could find to get high, you know, was really it. But predominantly drinking, smoking weed every single day of my life. And you know, college and things were on the back burner. Now all this, so through all that legal stuff, I ended up with like a 5-year probation sentence. And, you know, had to report every month and drug tests and counseling and all that. And I did all the physical things I was supposed to do, but I never stopped using. I can't remember what they were called now, but all the how you get through drug test things, the drinks and the pills, and like whatever all that shit. I did all of that shit all the time to go pass my drug tests.
Wow.
And, yeah.
Sounds expensive.
It probably was. Yeah, I don't remember. And then it just gets hazy as to arrests and things like that. But along the way, I ended up at 19, I ended up in NA. I don't think out of treatment, kind of on my own of like, yeah, I think this, like, I really think I have a problem now. I think I need to stop. Life isn't going. Oh, and I had went to college and dropped out, and then went to college again and dropped out. No, at that point, I'd only went once and dropped out, because it interfered with my partying.
Right.
And then I went to NA and went to meetings for a total of about 9 months and celebrated 9 months clean, but I didn't actually have 9 months clean. I went for several months and actually got clean and got a sponsor and started doing some stuff. And then somewhere in the middle there, my cousin had said, hey, you know, a group of us, and this is a female cousin with a bunch of her girlfriends from high school, said, hey, we're going down to senior week at Ocean City. Do you want to come stay with us? And I said, fuck yeah, because who wouldn't want to go stay with a group of high school seniors graduating for senior week? So I said, fuck yeah. So I went down to senior week and drank and partied with them that whole week, and then came back and was like, oh shit, I can't tell any of these people in NA any of this. These are all my new friends and people, so I'll just act like I'm still clean. And so I just acted like I was still clean and kept going to meetings.
Did you like use after that here and there?
No.
Or you just...
Yep, just that week up to 9 months. And I didn't think that it was okay. I knew. I don't know.
But imagine if there wasn't, right. I'm just thinking, imagine if there wasn't this prioritization of clean time or the stigma around the idea of relapse. And if it was just like, not a big deal. And if you'd have been able to talk about it and be honest, oh yeah, man, I slipped up. I went down there. I did that. You know, I'm back. I'm all in. Like, I wonder if that would have, you know what I mean? Like, who knows if you went back out because of the shame of feeling disauthentic or inauthentic with those people after a time? Or
yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to think back now to what, I mean,
sick as our secrets.
I could tell you what put me in the place of wanting to use again was going back around my old friends, you know, after that time, because there was something to be said for, like, I did like partying, you know what I mean? There is some fun around that stuff going and people carrying on and drinking games and lots of sex and you know what I mean? Like there's excitement in all
Not
of
as much
that.
random sex happens clean and sober. I gotta be honest. It just doesn't.
No, and when you're just showing up and like going to work and paying your bills, and there's not as much excitement. I mean, maybe there can be. I'm sure there can be. And I have different things that excite me now, but at 19, 20 years old, like,
yeah, I'm going to eat lunch when we leave here.
Yeah,
that
having
long-term
goals was not on my... healthy people might have long-term goals. Right. I did not. So then I just went back around my old friends and old people that I liked. And in the beginning said, I'm not going to use, but I'm still going to hang out with these guys and it'll be fun. And I really probably thought that, but whether I really thought it or just lied to myself is hard to say.
Right.
But then I ended up back around my old friends and started using again. And I'm not one of those people that came in and out or says it ruined their high or none of that happened. I went right back to getting high and was like, fuck yeah, like I'm good. And I did that for 8 years until I got clean this time. But then after that, I can't remember when heroin kind of came around to the area of Rising Sun. It was like the early to mid 90s, and then I did heroin for the first time, and I loved that. Was the new thing of like, oh, this is what I really been looking for my whole life. Like, this is what I want. And that got fairly unmanageable, a little more unmanageable than some of the other drugs.
Unsurprisingly.
Yeah. And so in the time that I actually was clean, my brother was in a really horrific accident. He was coming home from high school, bringing his girlfriend home, driving down the road, and a guy crossed the center line and hit them two head on at like 80 miles an hour. He was passing another car or a truck, and he couldn't see a car around there, so he just jetted out. And when he jetted out, they were there. He was going like 80-some mile an hour. My brother was probably going 60-ish mile, and they hit head on with no brakes. So, of course, tragic accident. My brother lived. He was severely messed up in the hospital for months and months of time with all kinds of reconstructive surgery. It killed his girlfriend at the time that was with him. And I mean, I was very selfish back then. It had some impact on me. I'm not going to lie, because I was clean at that time. And I tried to help him as much as I could, went and saw him in the hospital and did all that. I mean, I will say I'm grateful that I was clean in that time frame for my family and stuff. Probably for my mom, be one less thing to worry about. Although I'm sure she's still probably worried about me.
Right.
But by the time, this is a few years later, and by the time heroin came around, so he was sort of better. He had gotten a huge settlement from this accident, several $100,000, and was also, and at that time we had gotten to hanging out a lot, and we had gotten pretty close after his accident and started partying a lot together, and then we all got into heroin and stuff together, and he had all this money, so he bought this house, and we all just lived there in a big giant party house. And I still had a job. I still had my own job, and I still contributed somewhat to the house and did that. It wasn't like I just mooched off my brother for years, although he took care of me plenty. I'm not trying to act like I didn't, but he had other friends that it kind of would piss me off that did nothing and just hung out there with him and did his drugs all day.
Wonder if that was
girlfriends and things like that.
The mirror of yourself, though. Like they pissed you off because there was some of that going on for you too.
Oh, I'm sure it's because I was doing that to some level. It's not like I wasn't like totally self-sufficient. You know what I mean? There was some level of like, hey, I'm going to buy a bunch of heroin and here you can have some too.
Right.
And I wasn't like, no, I'm above that.
Right.
That was not happening.
My son's tradition states that I'm just not going to allow that there, brother.
Right. But he had this house, and we tried to maintain it to some level. We actually did pay bills. We had roommates. We all kind of paid rent, and people kind of had jobs in different facets. And then somebody's job along the way became just selling drugs out of the house. That became their job, and they were the ones going to Philly and getting the drugs. And so, like, my brother and I didn't have to be involved in that part of it for a long time. There was somebody doing all that part. We just had someone at the house all the time who paid in drugs. So it was kind of convenient. And it kept me out of certain elements of using that I didn't have to be involved with.
Right.
I wasn't somebody who had to run back and forth to Philly all the time or run back and forth to Baltimore all the time. I just never did. That wasn't something that I did. And so at that time, I worked for my family's business. And it's hard to say. I was a good employee. I could have been a much better employee, and I did embezzle money from their company.
I took some cash, but I was a good guy.
Well, and the only thing I mean by that is I managed a retail store for them, and the store was successful. Like, the store made money, and we sold, and I was good at sales and good at certain aspects of my job.
Not as much as it would have made if you wasn't stealing it.
Right, and that becomes the thing. Like, could it have been better? Could things have been different? Could I have taken on more responsibility or a different role in the company? all those things. And again, being high all the time, I don't know what world of delusion I could have been living in too. There could have been some delusional things going on there, like it was doing just fine whether I was there or not. That could have been real too. But I showed up for work, and I did some semblance of a job at a store that was somewhat successful. In a company that had 30-some stores that they weren't all successful. There were other stores that weren't successful. So anyway, but whether that could have been more luck, I can't say for sure. I don't attribute that to anything great that I was doing when I was on heroin in the bathroom. But in any case, at that point in my life, things did start to get pretty, like, that's a point in my life where I could really see, like, oh, fuck, I am definitely addicted to drugs. Like, I could not go without being high any amount of days. And then things started to that house got pretty crazy. It was, my brother played in a band with some other guys who played in a band, so we would have like a band there playing all the time, and people just drinking and partying and car crashes, and just any kind of chaos you could think that would come with a situation like that was that house. The cops were there bunches of times. I got arrested there at least once. They charged me with serving minor to alcohols because I was one of the only people there that was 21 and owned the house. So, it was like weird shit like that would happen. And the cops were there quite a bit for neighbor complaints and different things. And that's when things were pretty chaotic. And then there was an incident there where the cops did and I wasn't there for this event, but it was pretty severe. They did the kick the front door in drug raid on the house, like guys with guns and masks coming through the front and through the back and fucking breaking windows, and they were doing this like major drug raid on the house, and I happened not to be there. I happened to be with another guy out getting some other drugs. And that situation could have been really a lot worse than it turned out to be. Had they been like an hour later, we would have gotten in a lot of trouble because it was like a Friday night, and the guys that go to Philly and get all the heroin. So we used to, I guess I'm not giving anybody any good information, but what we used to do is pool all our money. We'd say, all right, who's got what to throw in for the heroin? We'd pool all our money. The one guy would go up and get whatever, and then we'd figure out how much we had to sell to make all our money back, and then divvy up the rest amongst each other. So you would, in essence, get yours for free as long as he could sell whatever to everybody else, you know? So we had a system worked out, something like that. Didn't always work out that well, but occasionally it did.
I'm just thinking about the incompetence of the police force that didn't know to wait another hour.
I know, right? So, and he was on his way back from Philly. I was out with another guy, and we went and got like an 8-ball of Coke, and we're coming back because it was Friday night. It was going to be like a party night with the band and the keg and all that stuff. I mean, that was like a normal. And we literally drove by the house with all the cop cars in the yard, me and the guy with the Coke, and we just kept on driving, you know, right on by. And we're like, holy fuck. So it was kind of that close to being like a serious situation. Not that it wasn't serious. They still charged us with all kinds of crazy stuff. And it sounded a lot worse than it was, or maybe it was minimalist thinking at the time, but I was charged with all kinds of heroin distribution, because there was things like scales and baggies and empty baggies and all kinds of paraphernalia everywhere, and we were trying to grow some pot plants that we weren't really growing, you know. We weren't good at cultists, not like we had a major weed, but we're a bunch of drug addicts trying to grow pot plants. So there was like 6 or 7 pot plants that were, you know, 3 or 4 feet tall growing in the fucking room, and just a lot of shit like that. It was like a failed drug addicts. And, but so they charged us with all of this stuff. I mean, there was 5 of us that lived there. All 5 of us got charged with, you know, distribution of heroin, distribution of marijuana, possession of all those things, maintaining a public nuisance, and then conspiracy charges on all that, which doubles everything that they put a conspiracy on. You know, it's just a bunch of crazy shit.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, that was, like, ridiculous, and that's the way it felt. It's like, this is ridiculous. Like, we're not major drug dealers, you know, supplying to all of Cecil County. It's like, but it doesn't matter.
Or maybe you were.
Yeah. And that was sort of a foray into me going to jail. That's how I ended up in jail. So that was a violation of probation, obviously. Through up until that point, I'd been able to either finagle or talk my way out of violating probation. Like, I would fail a drug test and be like, oh, but I am going to these meetings and I'm doing better, I'll try. And because I was like clean cut and shaved and wore a suit and tie to work every day and looked
white,
the right part, and white. Well, this was Cecil County too. So yeah, I was able to talk my way out of things a lot and get a lot of second chances and a lot of breaks because I looked the right part for someone trying to get their life together.
Right.
But getting my life together, not the way they thought I should get it together.
We got the heroin? Cool, I got the Coke. It's all coming together.
Right. It's good. I just do the heroin all night. And I do Coke to keep me up the next day. It works out. So yeah, things got pretty chaotic after that. And that started a series of events where it was like, well, there's no denying there's some real problems going on here. So I ended up doing a year in the Cecil County Detention Center, which is just the local. And for whatever reason, the judge saw that I was getting breaks, and he didn't like that very much. So he gave me all my time in lockup, like wouldn't even give me work release or anything. Wow. So it made me do. And at the time in Cecil County, you could only do a year was the maximum, or then they would send you down to Department of Corrections. Well, everybody kept telling me, oh, dude, you'll be fine. If they send you down to Department of Corrections, you'll get immediate release because they're overbooked and everything's crowded and you have no violent offenses. It's all just drug possession and petty shit. Like, they're not going to care anything about you. They're going to send you in with an ankle monitor. So I was like, yeah, that'd be great. I can do that. Fine. Just send me home so I can get high. That's really all I want to do. But that's not what happened. He ended up giving me 364 days in Cecil County Detention Center with no work release, which meant I had to stay here in Cecil County in lockup. And I only did like 8 months of that. But I spent my 21st birthday in jail, spent my 18th birthday in rehab. And that was my only real length of time spent in jail. Was in the Cecil County Detention Center. So I'd never been to prison or anything. After that was a series of trying to use successfully without using hard drugs. So after I got out of jail, I said, well, I'll just drink and I'll just smoke weed and that'll be fine. And I still just did those things to complete excess of my life. I still drank every day to black out, and just thought that was normal. That was, and you'd go to the alcohol classes and they'd be like, do you black out when you drink? I'm like, fuck yeah. That was the goal. Absolutely.
Do people drink for any other reason?
Right. And I just thought if I just drink and smoke weed, I'll be able to manage my life then it'll be okay. And it wasn't, I did that for about 4 years, and eventually ended up violating the probation on something or another. I can't remember. Oh, so from the whole thing with the drug raid on the house, I ended up with a 4-year suspended sentence. And so if I violated probation, I had to go do that 4 years. And then, of course, I violated that probation. And through this, I had gotten other arrests, too. And they are all vague. And, I think I've had at least 4, maybe 5 DUIs sprinkled in there in different places, and a couple different possession arrests that would always be plea bar. So I always had lawyers, and I never quite, my experience with the legal process was I would go in, the lawyer would be like, all right, here's what you're charged with. This is what you're going to plead to. This is what you're going to have to do. And I would either go, okay, or no, I don't want to do that. But I never quite paid much attention to what it actually meant in the long scheme of things. I don't know what that means. It was just go see the lawyer, and then, all right, well, what do you think I should do here? How do I stay out of jail? Probation? Sure. Or whatever.
So you were well versed in going to a power greater than yourself when you
right.
didn't know what to do.
Right. But I lost my license at times. I had my license taken away. I had to go through driving classes to get my license back, and alcohol monitor programs. All that stuff sprinkled in there somewhere along the way. But then, that 4 years was and I never did heroin, cocaine, acid, nothing, no heavy drugs. I just was going to drink and smoke pot and have a manageable using life. And, I managed. I ended up renting a room off a guy that also drank all the time, and I partied with him at his house and could never really maintain any sort of quality relationships. Could never maintain any sort of girlfriend type relationships. Those relationships were always relationships of convenience. I hung out with a girl as long as it was convenient and fun and felt okay, but as soon as somebody else came along, or she wasn't available, or she wasn't doing what I wanted to do, let's get a different girl. And I'm sure sometimes they would stop calling me. It wasn't like I pulled all the strings. Sometimes they just stopped calling me. I'm like, hey, where did she go? Why did she stop calling me? Fuck, she's not calling me back anymore. That happened too. But that was relationships were just kind of like that. They were just relationships of convenience, and there was no emotional or intimate connections. And then at some point, that life just got pretty shitty. I could see that it didn't matter what drugs I was doing or what drug it was. I used to excess until it took precedent over everything else in my life. Using had to come first, and then as long as I could use, then everything else could fall in line behind that. And when you're just drinking and smoking weed, that's a lot easier to maintain. But there's still a lot of chaos that comes with hey, I blacked out last night and spent all my money, and now I got to figure out what I'm going to do for rent. Hey, I blacked out last night and crashed my car into something, and I don't know what I hit or where I hit it, but my car is fucked up. That
Hopefully
kind
it wasn't
of
a person.
Yeah.
Or living.
Or asking people, hey, I don't know what I did last night. Do you remember, who I was with or where I was or what the fuck happened? There's just something about, I guess for me, I can't say for everybody, but something about what that just did to my soul that I was I'm just existing at this point. I'm not living a life that I'm happy with. I'm not living a life that I'm proud of. I, hurt and abused and took advantage of relationships with people that love me, like my family, my parents, aunts, uncles, relatives, all that sort of stuff. I mean, just to go back, I remember like I had my graduation party when I graduated from high school, and like 2 hours into my graduation party, my whole family had come, everybody had come to celebrate it. My parents put on this big party, and like 2 hours in, I'm like, all right, I got all my money now. Can I leave? Like, I want to go out with my friends. I don't want to be here for this party anymore. This shit's for you guys. It ain't for me. And getting into like an argument with my parents about that, and totally not seeing their point of view. You know what I mean?
Right.
Totally not seeing like, wait, this is supposed to be my party for me. I should be able to do what the fuck I want. Not appreciating that, hey, people came out of their way to give their time and attention to an accomplishment that you did.
Right.
And like not fully realizing at the time, like what I look at now is like, that's a conflict in my soul. Like, I know inherently somewhere in me, I know that shit's wrong. But I'm so caught up and self-consumed that I don't recognize it or own it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I violated that probation. I had this 4-year prison sentence, and I just thought, fuck. And my roommate at the time had a gun, and I thought, and nobody was there, and I was by myself. I said, I'm just going to blow my fucking head off because I can't keep living this way. This is going to be the rest of my life is going to be in and out of jail no matter what I try to do, no matter when I try to stop. Nothing has ever worked. I've been to treatment. I've been to meetings. I've done all that stuff, and nothing works. Like, I'm inherently fucked. And it was, I hate to say, like that light bulb moment or moment of clarity or whatever. It was like, could it be the drugs that are the problem? Could it be if you just stopped using, like things might get better for you? And I was like, I don't fucking know, and the only thing that kept me from killing myself was my mom. I knew my mom loved me, was the only person that ever cared about me, definitely more than I cared about myself at that point. I didn't give a fuck. I would go out and drink and drive, like, I don't really care if I wreck and die, like, who really cares? And some nights even thought, I'm just going to take this car off of this fucking road into this tree and just be done with this nightmare of a fucking mess I've created, and thinking that was normal, like thinking that's just part of, because they would ask you that stuff in counseling, like, do you ever think of killing yourself? And you're like, oh no.
Not once.
Yeah. But I always went through those programs thinking my job was to tell them what they wanted to hear, not to try to be any kind of honest or sincere. Because my goal wasn't to try to get better or healthy. My goal was to just get out of that.
Right. Because
my belief was that if I could just get high and use as much as I wanted, as often as I wanted, I would be fine. And that everyone else was the problem. And when you're surrounded with people that are using, like, that seems to make sense. And then I found my way to NA, and I had been to meetings throughout the years, and I had been court ordered at different times. I had popped into meetings over that 8-year period because I was court ordered to get my slip signed or whatever. And then I figured out I could just sign the slips however I wanted because they didn't fucking know anybody at meetings. Like, I was smart enough to figure out those concepts. Like, no one at the court is watching the people at NA. That's a completely different entity, and they're not even fucking allowed to ask. And if they do, the people in NA aren't even allowed to tell them that I was there or not. Like, so they can't even check on me if they wanted to, Right. It's a whole conflict of interest there.
Just gave a lot of people some ideas.
Yeah. So you can just fill out your own court slips. I mean, fuck it. If that's what you want to do, do it.
Steal a stamper at the next meeting you go to.
And so I would just, sign my slip. But anyway, I remember there was this meeting on Wednesday night. And all that happenstance on a Tuesday. And I went to that next day, woke up, decided I wasn't going to get high anymore. Well, that night, I smoked all my weed and got totally fucked up. Smoked all the weed that I had. All of it. Just kept rolling joints and smoked all of it.
Wow.
And the next day, woke up and went to a meeting and found my way into NA. And then that starts a whole other recovery journey.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was thinking about as, the time went up here towards the end of the episode. I was like, this is great. Not only does this become a 2-part thing where you get to tell your recovery version in another portion of this, but that also extends the portion before I have to tell my story.
I have to do yours.
So many similar things. I mean, just to point out a couple that struck me that, that feeling of wanting to fit in with the cool kids that necessarily weren't doing the best actions, being locked up when I turned 21, those kind of things, going to rehab for the first time at 17, like definitely compared in myself to a lot of that. And just some of it tragic, man. The ways we feel at the end, that really hit me pretty hard.
Yeah.
The hopelessness of that and the feeling of like, I'll never be any better. And really from a compassionate place of where I'm at now, like it was never about us being good or bad.
Well, and now in retrospect, like I look at so many things, like I had so many opportunities or breaks, that a lot of people don't get, that I'm now completely grateful for. Like I had a family that loved me, and at almost any time in my life, if I went to my parents and said, I need help, I need to go to treatment, they would have sent me to treatment. They would have paid for it. They would have done whatever. And they were always there to support me. And growing up, like I felt some sense of entitlement to that stuff and not realizing like, hey, like a lot of people don't even grow up with both parents, let alone two parents that love them and would do anything for them. And these times I wanted to go to college, I'd go to my parents. Hey, I think I want to go to college. Will you pay for me? Yep, we'll pay for you. So they were always there, like encouraging me and trying to motivate me. I mean, they had their flaws as parents, and some of that's contributed to my using. It's not like there's not something going on there, but I had a lot of things that it took me a long time to be grateful for and to really like be like, fuck, I'm so lucky.
Well, and I think that's been the shift as therapy goes on, right? It's not really blaming the parents. It's not that the parents were terrible or wanted bad things for the kids, right? It's really has nothing to do with their level of love whatsoever. It's just what did the parents get in their lifetime and know how to provide, and what stress level were they under, which, we could get into a whole discussion about why having payments to parents on a monthly basis just because they have children is totally helping their stress level, if nothing else, in the financial aspect, providing a way for them to be better parents. But maybe that is something we address one day. But yeah, man, it was good to hear your story.
Yeah,
so thanks for being willing to share all that. And we will have to have a part 2 about where it goes once you find those rooms of Narcotics Anonymous.
Yeah, that part's easy.
You say so, but there's a lot in there too. So thanks for listening. That is a little bit about Billy, and we will continue to explore that. And I guess we will see you next week.
Yeah.
Did you like this episode? Share it with people you think might get something out of it. Check out the rest of our episodes at recoverystoredof.com. Also, while you're there, you can find ways to link up with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube, anything. We're always looking for new ideas. Got an idea you want us to look into? Reach out to us.